Chapter 1, Lovers Under the Moon. Henry. The fireflies buzzed and twinkled in the thick forest, encircling the two lovers beneath them. The forest was quiet except for the whistling wind, creating mood music for the couple below. The night sky seemed to be shining brighter than normal, as if shining specifically for Mae and Henry, celebrating their love. Mae leaned back into Henry's arms as they gazed up at the moon and stars. Her blue eyes seemed to soak in the glow of them. Henry slowly dragged his fingers up and down Mae's arm, relishing in the delicious feeling of her delicate skin. He savored every touch of her soft, milky white skin. It seemed to glisten in the glittering lights of the fireflies and the moon. Mae snuggled up closer to him and nestled into his neck. "I wish we could stay here like this forever," Mae whispered. Her words floated with the wind like a silent prayer to the moon goddess. She almost felt as though their hearts were being sewn together, as entwined as their bodies. Mae felt herself yearn for their ceremony when they could know for sure that they were mates and put their fears to bed forever. "Soon we will, my love, once the ceremony happens. Nothing will be able to separate us," Henry answered, squeezing her hand just a little. He spoke the words as if his belief alone could make them come true. He glanced again at the bright moon, knowing the goddess wouldn't disappoint him. "How can you be so sure?" The inflection in her voice stayed smooth and calm, but Henry knew a part of her was still worried. Mae remained perfectly still, pressed against Henry, and he tried to hold on to the feeling of it. Why would we fall so deeply in love like this if we weren't meant to be? Why would the goddess give us these feelings so deeply if we weren't mates? "You'll see as soon as the ceremony comes. We are destined for each other. Love like this is once in a lifetime. Mae, this must be what it feels like to be mated. I can't imagine it could get better than this." Mae sat up and turned to look at Henry. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was the smallest curve on the edges of her mouth. Her sharp eyes seemed to look right through him, and he felt naked under her glance, but he didn't mind. He wanted Mae to see him, all of him, and know him deeper than anyone else ever could. "You look surprised," Henry stated, a bit confused by her expression. Mae shook her head while her smile grew. "No, I know you love me. I just love hearing you say it and sound so confident." Mae smiled and giggled, sounding a bit like a schoolgirl. Henry brushed his hand across her cheek before leaning forward and kissing her softly. The heat and passion started to rise between them as their kiss grew. Mae reached out a hand and placed it on Henry's thigh as she moved closer to him. Henry moaned lightly but then pulled away, turned his face down, and away from her. He tightened one hand into a fist to try to control his impulses. A strong part of him wanted to take her right now and mate with her, but he knew he couldn't. They had to do things right. "What's wrong?" Mae asked, her cheeks blushing with a different emotion. She looked down, trying to hide the new glistening in her eyes, but he could see it. He knew she had no reason to doubt him, but she couldn't help feeling hurt any time he pulled away from her in such a manner, no matter how often he tried to reassure her. "Nothing, I love you so much, Mae. I just fear if I continued to kiss you, I wouldn't be able to stop. Everything within me craves you, all of you," he whispered, like a lover's secret. In this spot, this isolated patch of land in the neutral zone, all of their secret hopes and desires for their love seemed possible. He tried to hold on to that feeling and trust they would be together and unite their kingdoms. "Oh, Henry. I can hardly wait for our ceremony, for our wedding. I can't stand not being with you all the time. It's getting harder to sneak off to you, and even worse when I have to leave you." Mae looked back in the direction of her home, where her pack was waiting. He was certain at least April, her sister, would be up waiting for her to return. He thought a part of her might be worried that her father might still be up as well. Henry brushed a strand of hair away from Mae's face before holding her cheek in his hand. "Ah, Mae, just a few more weeks, and then we will never have to separate again." Henry kissed her deeper this time and growled lowly at her delicious taste. He grunted and forced himself to pull away from her. "You should head back. I wouldn't want your father to worry about you. I'm sure April is having a hard enough time as it is keeping them distracted from your absence." Mae nodded and hesitantly stood up. Henry also climbed to his feet and held her hands in his. The two of them locked eyes for a long moment as if they could truly communicate just through their stares. Mae smiled again and melted into Henry's touch. "Please know this won't be forever. Soon, we'll be mated and married. Soon, we'll be together, and nothing will ever keep us apart. Our love is stronger than any force that might try to keep us separated. Trust me, I love you too, Henry. I'd wait forever for you if I had to," she muttered softly. "You won't need to wait that long, I promise." Henry smiled weakly and pulled her in close. He kissed her cheek and the side of her head before silently praying to the moon goddess that Mae might indeed be his mate. "Go now, I don't want anyone to worry," Henry demanded. Mae gave him one last adoring look before running off into the woods toward her pack. Henry stood still watching her fade away into the distance. Henry let his body collapse back on the ground and stared up at the moon. He put his arms behind his head and tried not to dwell on the aching in his heart that started the moment Mae was out of view. He sighed heavily, and then Henry closed his eyes for a moment and tried to imagine his wedding day with Mae, after they had been mated. He smiled quietly to himself. "Oh, come now, Henry, it can't be that bad. She hasn't even been gone for 5 minutes. Though for a while there, I thought she'd never leave." Henry sat up abruptly and turned in the direction of the familiar voice. How had he been completely oblivious to the piercing blue eyes spying on him through the trees? As he glared behind the trees, he saw the pretty blonde the voice belonged to. He didn't feel up to dealing with her in his current state of mind. "What are you doing here, Circe?" Henry grumbled as he stood. He brushed the dirt off his pants and started walking away before she could answer. "I'm here for you, of course. To make sure you're all right." Circe moved gracefully but quickly until she was close enough to reach out and grab Henry's arm. She held on tightly to him and fluttered her eyes. "Why wouldn't I be okay?" Henry barked, pulling his arm away from her. "It's not like I'm in any kind of danger being around Mae," he answered with a scoff. He kept his eyes on her as if she might launch herself at him and attack. With the way she fawned after him, Henry wouldn't be the least bit surprised. Circe clicked her tongue and gave Henry a concerned look. She maneuvered around him, like a snake coiling around its prey. "See, that's exactly what I'm worried about. You are awfully attached to this woman who may or may not be your mate." "She is. She will be my mate." Circe. Circe smiled and gave him a doubtful look. It was just too easy to play on his fears, but nothing seemed to turn his heart away from Mae. Circe couldn't understand what he could possibly see in her, or what Mae could offer him that Circe couldn't. The jealous monster grew stronger inside of her and seemed to take over all control of Circe's words and actions. She would have Henry, she was sure of it, so certain and confident. What will you do when she's not? Would you ditch your mate to be with this woman you love? Circe crossed her arms behind her back and smiled, baiting Henry to argue with her. He paused for a moment and tightened his hands into fists. Her sweet smile turned into a wicked smirk as she realized she was under his skin. Henry shook off the fear and glared at her. "What do you want, Circe? Did you come here just to piss me off and mess with my head? Mae is my mate. You'll see." Henry practically spat the words at her and narrowed his eyes to slits. "I suppose soon we'll all see. I just hope you're right, for your sake and hers. Can you imagine what it would do to her if you weren't her mate? She'd have to watch you with someone else, marry someone else. It would crush her." Circe's words came out quietly, slipping into Henry's ear like a dangerous poison. He stumbled in fear for a moment. Circe had heard their conversation. She knew he had spent so much time fighting that idea, convincing himself just as much as Mae that wouldn't happen. "She is my truest love, that means something. We will find a way." Without another word or waiting for Circe's response, Henry stomped off into the woods. Circe gazed after him and let the rage build inside of her. She slammed her hands on her hips and tried to imagine what she could do. She was tired of trying to woo him to her. She needs to do something more drastic to capture his attention. "If I can't have you, no one can," she mumbled after him. Somewhere in the distance cooed a mystical owl, and the wheels in Circe's head started to turn in a new direction. She glanced over to the east and could sense the call of magic from the mountain. She could feel a plan starting to form, and a wide smirk spread across her face. Chapter 2, Sisterly Love, Mae reached the edge of her town before she even broke a sweat. She slowed down as she reached the pathways of the sleepy borough. The normal night guards were still stalking about, but everything else was quiet. Still, Mae walked carefully and noiselessly through the streets, knowing the best path to take to her home. She had done this so many times, she had practically memorized the schedules and paths of the guards. Not that any of them would dare harm her or arrest her, but there was no need to waken her father unnecessarily. She almost giggled to herself at how easy this was and how often she had gotten away with it. When she reached the Alpha's mansion in the middle of the city, she moved around back to the large open window. She could see a small light on and the curtains blowing. April was still awake waiting for her. Mae smiled to herself as she started to climb the tree next to her bedroom window. Gracefully, she climbed before jumping in and through the window. When Mae straightened herself up, she saw her sister was sitting on her bed, reading some coverless book. April hadn't even looked up from the page she was currently on when Mae entered. Mae smiled and jumped onto the bed beside her sister. "What are you reading?" Mae asked, trying to get an idea from the few words she could make out before April closed the book. April kept the closed book in her lap and tried to make her best annoyed expression at her sister. "It's a book about the history of our pack and its creation. Mrs. Hallow let me borrow it. Do you know what time it is?" April demanded, trying to force as much frustration in her voice as possible. "I know I have the best little sister in the world to stay up and wait for me, and make sure no one notices that I came home late," Mae answered playfully. She reached over and started to tickle April's side. April tried to pull away but ended up losing her pretend irritation and laughing out loud. Okay. Stop. I give up. But you better believe I'm the best sister in the world. Daddy came in here earlier looking for you. He started to get pissed, insisting you were out with Henry. I convinced him you were having lady troubles and were just bathing outside." "That doesn't even make sense," Mae answered laughing. April joined her in giggling. "I know. I really thought I'd have to explain more, but he was so weirded out by lady troubles he disappeared without asking any more questions," April answered. The two sisters continued to giggle and laugh together, making little jokes about their father. When their laughter faded, the two of them sat there quietly together for a moment before Mae leaned in and hugged her sister tightly. "Thank you for covering for me for so long. Thank you for always supporting me being with Henry," Mae whispered. April held on to her sister and pulled her close. "Of course, that's what sisters are for. Once the ritual happens, and Daddy has no more excuses, it'll all be good. You two can get married, and we can finally start to heal our packs. I hope so." Henry always sounds so confident. He's so convinced that we wouldn't feel this way if it wasn't meant to be. He tells me the moon goddess has to support our love, and we will be mates. I mean, most of the time, I believe that too. I guess I'm just a little fearful still. Mae pulled away from her sister and sat up, turning her face away from her. She started to pick lightly at the dirt in her fingernails. Rationally, she knew they were most likely mates. Everything Henry always said made so much more sense, but every time she thought about it, she couldn't help feeling just a little bit of fear that it wouldn't be the case. April scooched over and reached out a hand to rub Mae's back. "That's totally understandable, Mae. This is a tricky situation. It's completely normal that you'd feel this way, but I can't imagine that you two wouldn't be mated. That seems almost like it would go against nature." April let out a small laugh, but when Mae peered over her shoulder, still somber, April let her laugh go. "I know you're totally right. I should just be excited. I should be thinking about all the possibilities that could happen once we are together. It's all going to be so wonderful once we are mated and married." Mae stood up and started kind of pacing around, letting her mind go wild with ideas. "There you go. Let's just focus on that. What do you think it'll be like?" April asked, bouncing on the bed a little bit. She smiled at her sister, egging her into imagining the future with her. Mae turned and smiled at her. "Well, I have this beautiful idea of us mating together, out in the forest in our secret place. I imagine Henry scattering rose petals and lighting some candles. It'll be such a magical night," Mae explained. She twirled the edges of her hair in her fingers, getting lost in the daydream. "That sounds beautiful. How do you think it'll feel?" April asked, getting more excited for her sister. "I don't know. I mean, it's a branding mark. Normally, I'd think it'd be painful, but I've heard it's supposed to actually be really pleasurable." Mae's cheeks started to flame, and she imagined they were turning a dark shade of pink. "You know, it's interesting. I love Henry more than anything. I want this so bad, but I'm still a little nervous to mate with him and be together for the first time." "You think that's normal?" "Of course. That's totally normal. I think it'll be better and easier in the moment, because you do love Henry so much, but it's a new experience for you. I think it's totally natural to be a little nervous. You think it'll be easier in the moment. I think once you're there, you know he's your mate, and you see that magical scene you've been dreaming about, it'll all just come easily. You know Henry will make you feel comfortable," April offered. Mae nodded and took a seat back on the bed next to her sister. The two of them sat quietly for a long moment, letting their minds wander to the uncertain future. "You think Daddy is going to be okay?" Mae asked in a low voice. April sighed and kept her eyes on the ground. I know he gives you a hard time with Henry and this whole situation has been difficult, but you know he doesn't really want a war. No one does. Henry's father might really want a war. He seems worse about this than anyone, Mae interrupted. Okay, you may be right about that, but you know Daddy doesn't want a war. He's just hesitant because he wants to protect you and keep you safe. But once it works out, and you two are married, he'll be okay, it'll all be okay, then you two can start really working on healing our packs. April seemed to be trying to sound as enthusiastic as she could. Mae turned to her and smiled, patting April's leg. Thank you for saying that, I really appreciate that. I don't know what worries me more, not matching with Henry, or our fathers losing it over us being together. Mae let out a fearful laugh. Hey no, don't think about that. Just think about how good it's going to be. It's going to go well. Ugh, yeah, I know you're right. Mae stood up again and started her worried pace around the room. I'm trying to just think positive and think about only the good stuff, but for some reason, I can't seem to let go of these little fears. April stood up and went to hug her sister. Mae, it's all going to be all right. I know these fears are still there and won't just go away, but you can't keep dwelling on them. Everything is going to be great, you'll see. Soon you'll be mated, and everything will be okay. Yeah, you're right. Come on, tell me about all your fun wedding ideas, April offered, hopping back on the bed. Mae turned and smiled at her before nodding and joining her on the bed. I was thinking we could be showered with lily flowers and pearls. Doesn't that sound pretty? Yes, it really does. Where do you want to have it? I'm not sure, but I was certainly thinking about having it outside, just wild in nature with the sunset and then the moonlight. I want to have lots of dancing, maybe a band. Oh, that would be so great. Little twinkling lights and dancing in the moonlight. Aw, that sounds so perfect for you guys, doesn't it? Do you think Henry would be okay with that? April chuckled. I think Henry would completely agree to anything and everything you might want for your wedding. He'll just be so happy he gets to marry you. He is wonderful, isn't he? I just can't believe my big sister is getting married. April exclaimed. Mae quickly tried to quiet her down, worried that she was a bit too loud. Well, I'm not getting married yet. Nothing has happened yet, but you know it will, April replied with a wink. Yeah, maybe we should get some sleep, Mae said with a yawn. She laid down on the bed and stretched. Alright, we'll get some sleep. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, April stated with a wink. She patted her sister's knee before tiptoeing to the door and walking out to her own room. Mae stretched again before getting up and changing into her pajamas. She let her mind wander again to dreams of Henry, their mating ritual, and their wedding. She couldn't think of anything that would make her happier. She tried to convince herself that her fears were just little irrational ideas and that everything would be great. She moved to the window and looked up at the moon. While the wind blew gently across her face, Mae took a deep breath and tried to listen to the moon goddess. She made a silent prayer that the moon goddess might grant and approve of her relationship with Henry. Mae suddenly felt a rush of wind and positive energy flow from the breeze through her. Mae felt her fears disappear, and she was filled with a new feeling of peace and serenity. Comforted by the wind, she moved to her bed and lay down to sleep with pleasant dreams of her future with Henry. Chapter 3. The Witch in the Woods. Circe walked quietly through the woods and followed the flow of magic towards the top of the mountain. Part of her felt a little worried and nervous to see the wild witch, but she tried to find her inner strength and remind herself why she was doing this. As she walked, the trees seemed to be losing their color and bending toward her like a canopy. Circe stepped lightly and kept her eye out for anything dangerous that might be lurking in the woods. She had heard so many haunting rumors about the witch in the woods, she couldn't help keeping her head on a swivel. She listened to all the noises and the cries of other wolves around. The pull of magic was definitely getting strong as she moved up the mountain. Circe's heart started to pound more wildly in her chest. It skipped a beat with every snapping of a branch or call of an animal in the distance. The path started to curve, and suddenly the hooting of owls grew loud and echoed through the trees. Circe stopped for a moment and tried to see the owls around. Despite her sensitive wolf sight, she couldn't spot any of them. She felt a small chill rise up her spine. Had she been imagining the sounds? She paused for a moment and questioned if it was worth it to continue on this ominous journey. Picturing Henry with his arms around her, she felt warm and comforted by the image, but then Mae's face popped into her head, and Circe filled with jealous rage again. Suddenly, her fear disappeared, and she felt a new sense of confidence. With a scowl on her face, she continued up the mountain. Circe walked faster, ignoring the cries of the owls. She turned the corner and saw the cottage in the distance. Smoke was blowing heavily through the chimney, and the place was surrounded with twinkling lights and the glow of fireflies. On the outside, it looked like any normal cottage, with just a few small hints at magic brought about by the lights. Despite its beautiful appearance, Circe got an eerie feeling. Nothing felt right about this place, and it made her shiver a bit. It was as if there was a pulsing energy around the house warning people to stay away. She forced herself to move forward and knock on the door. The house was quiet, despite the lights and smoke. It almost seemed as if no one was home. Circe wondered if she should leave or try to knock again. As she raised up her hand, the door swung open to reveal a wild, unkempt, frightening woman. Circe instinctively stepped back. The witch's hair was long and dark with dreads and braids intermixed. Her eyes were a piercing green covered in dark smoke. All of her clothes were tattered and torn, while covered in barnacles and shells. Around her shoulders hissed a shimmering green snake that fixed its slitted eyes on Circe. The witch smirked at Circe and leaned seductively against the side of the door. "Well, little wolf, you're a long way from home. Especially for being all alone on such a cold, dark night. How can I help you?" Her words dripped out like vinegar, and Circe backed up further. With her lips trembling, the words would not cooperate. "I want you to do a spell for me," Circe finally forced out. The witch smiled wider, revealing her sharp teeth. "You want me to do a spell for you? Is that all? Well, little wolf, what can you offer me in return?" Even the snake around her neck seemed to be smirking back at Circe. What would you want?" The witch cackled again. As she threw her head back, Circe saw detailed scars and tattoos swirling around the witch's chest. Circe wrapped her arms around herself and tried to build up her courage. "Come on in, dearie, we can talk about the price later. My name is Ravina, don't worry, I won't bite." Ravina winked at Circe as she stepped aside. Hesitantly, Circe walked into the house, making sure to keep a safe distance from the snake. The small cottage was filled with candles, plants, and jars that were filled with what looked like intestines and blood. Circe's eyes were drawn to all of the gruesome contents. Even though she wanted to look away, what had she gotten herself into? "Tell me what kind of spell you're looking for, Wolfie," Ravina demanded, moving to sit down on a chair at her table. Ravina causally petted the head of her snake. Slowly, Circe moved to sit down next to her. Before she lost all courage, she blurted it out. "I want this man. I'm pretty certain he is meant to be mated to another wolf. He's in love with her, and it's driving me crazy," Circe mumbled. "Oh, I see. And you wish this man would start paying more attention to you. I understand. Did you want me to kill this other girl? Something along those lines? What? No. No. No one has to die. I want you just to change who they are mated to, so I end up with Henry." Circe felt her heart jump in her chest. She backed her chair away from Ravina a little. "Well, that is certainly simpler and will be easier to accomplish. So Henry shall be mated to you. What about this other woman? Her name is Mae." "I don't know. I don't really care. Just not Henry," Circe barked. Ravina gave Circe a curious stare and frightened Circe deeply. The snake around her neck seemed to almost be leaning in as if ready to strike. "I'll need a name, dearie, if this is going to work." Ravina's tone had turned to ice. Her eyes seemed as dark and narrow as her pet. Circe instinctively backed up again. "Fine, she can mate with Nathan. That would be perfect for Mae," Circe offered with a satisfied scoff. Circe pictured Mae finding she's mated to Nathan, such a wimpy man without even a hint of alpha in him. She couldn't help but let a wide crooked smile spread across her face. "Well, there you go. You shall be mated to Henry, and Mae will be mated to this Nathan. Now I'll need you to bring me a piece of Henry and Nathan's fur. Can you do that?" Yes, I think I can do that. I can bring it back to you tomorrow. Is that acceptable?" Ravina smiled and gave Circe a curious look. Circe swallowed hard and tried not to show that she was afraid. "Let's just be sure this is all you want," Ravina cooed. "What do you mean? Surely, you've heard the rumors about me, my dear. You risked it all to see the witch in the mountain, and all you want is a little switch. I would think you'd be asking for so much more." Ravina went back to sweetly petting her slithering pet. Circe swallowed hard. She realized how little she had thought this plan through. Other wishes and thoughts had crossed her mind, but she wasn't sure it'd be worth whatever price Ravina could come up with. Besides, she didn't care so much about causing Mae pain, she just wanted Henry. I can get you the fur by tomorrow, but all I want is to switch mates. I just want Henry to be mine. Do we have a deal? Circe asked, trying to sound as confident as she could. Ravenna stared at Circe and remained unnaturally still. The snake started to move down her arm and slink between Ravenna's fingers. Circe took her hands off the table slowly. She started to feel as if she should say something else, or should she just get up and leave? All right, dearie, bring me what I require by sundown tomorrow, and we'll see if you still want a deal then. Circe nodded, unsure what else to say or do. You can leave now, dearie. Circe stood up quickly and sped towards the door. She walked as quickly as she could back down the path, forcing herself not to look back. The next evening, Circe gripped the small pouches of fur in her hand as she hesitantly walked back up the mountain. Several times, she stopped and wondered if this was truly what you wanted to do, but every time she paused, she pictured Henry's face. Circe forced herself to keep walking up the mountain in the fading sunlight. The owls hooting welcomed Circe to what she could only think of as the haunted house of the witch. Circe knocked lightly on the door. Come in, dearie, Ravenna called from inside. Circe pushed the door open and was hit instantly with a wave of the most repulsive smell. Circe held back a gag and forced herself to breathe through her mouth. Moving through the small space, Circe sat down quietly at the table. She watched as Ravenna continued to stir her poisonous mixture in a boiling pot on her stove. You're late, dearie. I wondered if you were coming at all. I thought perhaps you changed your mind, but now you're here. Are you still certain this is what you want? Yes, I am. I brought the fur you required. She'd been able to follow along behind Henry when he was out on his morning run and grab some fur that had gotten caught in a bramble. Nathan's had been harder to track down since he didn't shift often, but luckily, she had been able to trick him into going for a run with her late that afternoon and pushed him into a rose bush. Some of his fur got caught on a thorn, and she went back later to get it, still stirring her pot. The witch looked over her shoulder with a wicked smile. Oh, excellent. Place the fur on the table, Ravenna demanded. Circe put the bags on the table and waited patiently for what Ravenna ordered her to do next. She couldn't help but look around for the snake or any other wild surprises that might be lingering around. Now, I'll cast the spell tonight. Are you certain you're willing to pay the price? Well, we haven't exactly talked about price, but I'll pay whatever you want. Just please do this for me. Circe didn't mean to shout, but she was frustrated with the back and forth. She wanted it done. She knew Henry and Mae were destined to be mated any time now. The mating ceremony was only a few days away. Ravenna laughed wildly. She stepped away from her boiling pot and walked towards the table. Ravenna kept her eyes on Circe and looked a little frightening as she picked up the bags of fur on the table. Ravenna continued to mumble some words toward the pot. The smoke coming off the edges started to glow a deep blue and rose higher. Ravenna's mumbling became louder, and it took all of Circe's courage to stay planted in her seat. She watched in mesmerizing horror as Ravenna continued. The blue haze of the potion reflected off of Ravenna's pale skin, making her look almost sickly. Ravenna continued to speak her jumbled words and threw in the fur patches. Circe gripped the edge of the table to keep herself from running out. She wasn't sure how long she watched in trepidation, but finally, the pot sort of exploded out, and she knew it was done. As the smoke cleared, Circe looked up to see Ravenna's haggard and wild appearance. She was staring at her with the strangest expression, and Circe swallowed hard. Now, my dear, we talk price. Chapter 4. The Mating Ritual. Mae stared off into the distance while April decorated her hair with little flowers. The older sister tried to calm all the nerves rising in her. This should be a happy day. It would be a happy day. Rationally, she knew that. She tried to picture that final moment when she saw Henry waiting for her true mate. Are you excited? You look beautiful, April whispered, with a pep in her voice. Mae nodded lightly. She didn't want to get into all her fears that still lingered. She just wanted to think about Henry and this day being over. Thank you for doing my hair, Mae mumbled, doing her best to sound positive. Of course, Henry is going to be so awestruck when he sees you. You look amazing. April brushed some of Mae's hair back so it rested more gently against the side of her face. Yeah, I hope so. April gripped Mae's arms and turned her around. Her eyes would hardly focus on anything, much less her little sister staring at her. She felt as if she was in a daze. What is wrong? You can't still be nervous? I mean, after everything Henry said to you last night, you know you two are meant to be together. We are going to go to the ritual, and everything is going to be wonderful, you'll see. April pulled her sister into her arms and held her tight. Mae was constantly surprised but grateful that Henry and her sister maintained their positivity. I know you're right. Well, then are you ready to go? April asked, standing up, starting to jump in excitement. Yes, you know what? Yes, I am, let's go. I'm so ready to be mated to Henry and start our lives together, Mae exclaimed. Mae took April's hand and let her guide her out of the bedroom and down the stairs. Oh darling, you look wonderful, Keith offered as he reached over to kiss Mae's cheek. It's going to be a wonderful ritual tonight. Keith held out both of his arms for his daughters. Mae wondered how much her father really believed it would be a wonderful ceremony. She wasn't sure how he felt about her marrying Henry. The Packs were rivals, after all. They walked together through the forest and out to the sacred area of the mating ritual site. Mae's stomach was in knots. Crowds of people gathered around to celebrate the ritual. Flowers and little lights decorated the circles where all the wolves of the correct age for the ritual were gathering. Mae gazed around and saw Henry standing with Circe and a few others she recognized. The knots seemed to tighten around her insides. April, can you just tell me one more time that everything is going to be all right? Mae whispered, leaning over to her sister. Mae kept her eyes straight ahead, locked on Henry. She worried if she looked anywhere else, she might cry. Yes, I promise. It's going to be great. Now, go take your place in the circle. April nudged her sister forward. Mae looked up and let her father kiss her cheek again and then took her place. The ritual leader stood in the middle of the circle, the light of the full moon pouring down on her, and raised her hands to welcome everyone to come gather around. She looked stoic and serious, much too solemn for such a joyous event. Welcome, everyone, to the sacred mating ritual. Let us begin. Thank you, beautiful goddess of the moon, for being here with us and guiding us through this powerful experience. We offer you our worship and devotion with our songs and dance. The leader raised her arms to the sky and started to lead the crowd in song. Goddess of all the wolves in creation, hear our songs of praise, we follow your gentle rotation and hear our voices raised. Ignite the love and passion between the chosen mates, help them walk together through the wedding gates. We love you, moon goddess, with all our souls and hearts, we worship you forever, let us never part. Mae sang the words and did her best to really feel them in her heart and let the moon goddess know how much she wanted to be with Henry. She tried to hear Henry's words in her mind again, that they wouldn't be so in love and connected if they weren't already mates. They went through many different songs together and danced wildly in the moonlight. Mae tried to keep her focus and her eyes on Henry but had a very difficult time concentrating. Now, it's time, I ask the male partners to come forward and take their piece of nature to let them know where to wait. Ladies, please step to the edge of the circle and wait until the time to search has begun. Mae hesitantly moved to the back of the circle and waited. She kept her eyes locked on Henry, and he continually sent glances back to her. The ritual leader handed each of the men their pieces of nature, and Henry gave one last look at Mae before heading off to his location. The leader led everyone in the dismissal song as the men wandered off to their sacred locations. Mae felt her heart flutter and ache a bit for Henry. She watched him until he disappeared into the shadows of the trees, trying to memorize his path. Mae felt like she waited for several hours when it was only about 20 minutes. Her head jerked up in a sort of panic when the ritual leader called for attention again. Now, it is time for the women to find their truest mate. Will the women please come forward? The ritual woman held her arms up and called up to the moon goddess, please send down your light and your blessings to guide these women to their destined mate. We thank you for being with us and guiding these women to their truest love. Abruptly, the moon shone brighter and seemed to sparkle like a giant diamond in the sky. Then, several different beams shot out of it and landed like little orbs in the leader's hands. She called out a blessing upon the lights and slowly they floated over to their destined person. Here we are in the final moments of this sacred night. The time has come to find the truest mates of our joined packs. Ladies, please follow your lights. As if on cue, the lights flew up in the air and slowly started to lead down the correct paths. Mae looked back at her family and watched her sister give her an encouraging look. Mae turned back and started following the light forward. She felt nervous and as if her stomach was crawling up into her throat. The light twinkled and glittered, inviting her to her near future. Mae just pictured Henry's face and tried to imagine that moment when she arrived to see him standing there waiting for her. She continued to whisper silent prayers to the moon goddess. This is it. This is what she and Henry had been waiting for. The light seemed to glow bright and radiate positive vibes. The orb swerved and moved through the trees. Mae eagerly followed its direction and tried to keep her excitement up, ignoring the nerves coursing through her veins. Soon, you'll see Henry, and all will be okay. You know it's Henry. It's all going to be okay, Mae continued to mutter quietly to herself. She heard the rhythmic thump of a heartbeat in the distance, and her own started to grow stronger as well. She rushed forward and turned a corner, following the orb. Her heart was screaming with anticipation of seeing Henry, but that's not who was waiting for her. Nathan, Henry's cousin, was standing by a thick tree with a small smile on his lips. His brows reached his hairline when Mae came into view, appearing equally surprised as she was. Mae felt her heart and her stomach drop to her toes, nearly knocking her to her knees. Henry stood in the designated spot, pacing back and forth in a weird circle. He felt like his nerves were so tight that he was actually cramping. His back muscles were stiff, and his brow knitted together in a tight frown. He was starting to leave marks in the grass from pacing the same spot over and over. He never wanted to show his fears in front of Mae, but he couldn't help feeling them all now. Henry felt almost as if he was going to throw up. He kept tightening his hands into fists and releasing them slowly. He waited anxiously for Mae and almost wanted to walk back part of the way down the path to see if he could see her. He wished they could have met at their special, secret spot, but they had to follow the ritual. Henry started to hear a heartbeat and footsteps coming toward him. His eyes snapped forward in the direction of the sound. He couldn't wait to hold Mae in his arms and celebrate their union. Henry's mouth dropped, and his hands balled into fists when around the edge of the trees appeared Circe. She had a wild grin that seemed to hold some kind of secret. Henry's frown grew deeper. He was unamused. What? Is this some kind of joke? What the hell are you doing here? Henry demanded. Circe smirked widely and did her best to walk toward him seductively. What are you talking about, lover? My light led me here. I am your true mate. Circe started picking at her nails, keeping her secretive smile. That's impossible. I'm meant to be mated with Mae. What did you do? Henry couldn't help raising his voice and backing away from Circe. He felt a deep, fearful rage boiling inside him, and he was worried about what he might do if Circe came closer to him. Henry, what do you mean? I would never do anything to Mae. The moon goddess chose us to be together. How could I have possibly messed with this? Circe answered, doing her best to sound hurt. She tried to make it seem as if she was on the verge of tears, but it was truly taking all her energy not to laugh out loud. I can't believe this. I can't believe this is true. Henry's voice faded as he continued to pace the patch of grass beneath him and tried to wrap his head around the situation. Circe couldn't help but giggle softly to herself. She turned away from Henry to hide most of her glee and excitement. Well, lover, should we embrace in our first mated kiss? Circe suggested, trying to stand in a sexual pose. Henry turned around and stared at her with a wildfire of disdain in his eyes. Chapter 5. You're not my mate. Henry, you are out of your mind if you think I'm going to come anywhere near you, much less kiss you. Henry barked. I don't know how this happened, or how things got messed up, but you are not my mate. He continued to pace around and did his best to avoid moving too close to Circe or meeting her eyes. I know you love Mae, but why are you fighting this so much? You will grow to love me. Circe moved closer to him and ran a finger down his arm. Henry shivered at her touch and felt his muscles cringe away from her. He made a dramatic gesture to pull away from her. I could never grow to love you. I need to find Mae. Henry snapped his words with a feeling of finality before marching off into the woods. His head felt wild with fear and confusion. Henry could hear Circe calling after him and her jagged footsteps as she threaded into the woods after him. He tried to shut out any sound of her and ignored her pleading for him to come back to her. She kept yelling out that they were mated now, and he had no reason to go after Mae anymore, that Mae was probably happy with her mate, but Henry couldn't believe that. He had to see Mae. He had to talk to her. They needed to figure this whole thing out. Henry stomped through the woods and absent-mindedly headed to their secret spot. Something inside him told him that Mae would be waiting, that she would be just as heartbroken and confused as he was. He tried to let go of the wild thoughts and Circe shouting after him, and just focused on his heart being called by Mae's. She's not your mate. I don't know why you can't just accept this, Henry. Just come back to me so we can join the celebration," Circe called out. He could tell she was a great distance behind him now. The wolf inside him growled with frustration and anger. Henry picked up his pace and started to run toward the spot, leaving Circe further behind him. He couldn't think, he couldn't breathe, he couldn't do anything about their situation until he saw Mae. Until he could hold her, kiss her, and figure out what happened. Why would they be so in love if they weren't meant to be together? Had they offended the moon goddess in some way? Why would she take their love away like this? So many questions reeled in Henry's head. He started to feel almost dizzy from all the unknowns spinning around in his mind. Henry ran on, hoping he could outrun this situation. Hoping he could run into the special clearing with Mae, and she'd tell him that there had been a mistake. She was his mate after all. Everything inside of him screamed and called out for Mae. Part of him wanted to run even beyond that. Part of him wanted to grab Mae and run away where no one could stop them from being together. He didn't care if she was his true mate or not. They were mated in his heart, and he couldn't live without her. He wanted to run until their lungs burned and the questions had all poured out of his head. Somewhere no one would recognize them and they could be together in peace, but he knew Mae wouldn't leave her family. They had to figure this out together. Here, Henry slowed down as he reached the edge of the clearing. He could already hear Mae in the opening. Her heartbeat was racing faster than normal, and she was sniffling. Clearly, she had been crying. His heart ached for her, the need to comfort her strong. He pushed his way through the trees and pulled her mouth to his. It was wet and hot since they were both angry and on edge. Her tears kept flowing down and intermixing with the taste of her mouth. Henry didn't care. He kept her as close to him as possible and held on until they both needed a break to breathe. "What happened, Henry? You said we would be mated. You said there was no way we wouldn't be. I can't stand the thought of us not being together. Thinking of you mating with someone else, marrying someone else." Mae's voice started to shake, along with the rest of her body. He could tell she could barely control her tears and heavy breathing. I know, my love, I can't stand it either. It burns me inside to think of anyone else touching you. There has to be something wrong, some mistake somewhere. This can't be real," Henry argued. His voice was gruff and revealed how furious he was, but he held her close and tenderly, never squeezing too hard. "When I turned and saw Nathan. You mated with Nathan? He's nothing. Barely earning the name of a wolf at all. How can the daughter of an alpha be mated to someone like him?" Henry barked. He turned quickly to hold Mae and reminded her that it wasn't her he was upset with. I know. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, but I just started crying. I couldn't stand it. I ran here." Mae was starting to hyperventilate a little, recalling the moment. Henry ran his hands up and down her arms and kissed her forehead. Mae sniffed against his shoulder. "I'm sorry, my love. I'm sorry, but this has to be some sort of mistake. You and I are meant to be together. I just know it." Henry looked up at the moon in a pleading fashion, as if expecting the goddess herself to come down and explain the situation. As if she'd apologize for the mistake and set things right. "How can this be a mistake? I followed the light and it didn't take me to you. The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes like that." Mae choked out through several breaths. I don't know how this happened or what went wrong. I just know it's got to be a mistake," Henry grumbled. "I love you. Every part of me yearns for you. My heart breaks without you. Mae, we are meant to be together. I just know it." He pulled Mae in closer to him again and tried to calm her wild tears and body shakes. "Or, the more obvious answer, which is you're not," Circe answered from the trees. She stayed on the outside just out of view. Henry and Mae searched around for her, following the sound of her voice. Henry felt the fiery rage building in him again, and his hands instinctively balled into fists. "I told you, Circe, I don't know what happened or what you did to create this outcome, but you are not my mate," Henry cried out. Mae pulled away a little bit and looked up at him. "Circe? You mated with Circe?" Mae's voice sounded even more hurt if that was possible. Circe appeared out of the trees with a wide grin. Henry felt like his heart was literally breaking in two inside of his chest. His knees were weak watching Mae be in so much pain. "Yes, but I feel nothing for her. I only want you, you know that. I love only you, Mae." Henry tried to reach out and hold Mae again, but she kept herself at arm's length. "I don't want anything to do with her, Mae, please, yet, you have no choice. I am your mate, Henry, it's time you accept that. We do have other rituals and ceremonies to get onto. Circe had lost the sweetness in her tone and now sounded just as angry and aggressive as Henry. I will never accept that. I love Mae. I only want to be with her, Henry snapped back. But you can't. Not anymore. You knew you ran the risk of not being mated. Well, it happened. You're with me now, Henry. I don't care what you need to do to be okay with that, but do it, Circe howled. She turned her eyes to Mae, and they narrowed into slits. And you, I don't ever want to see you around my mate again. Henry quickly stepped in front of Circe and between the two women. Do not talk to her like that. She can be near me and around me whenever she wants. She is my true love. Henry screamed. He felt ready to launch himself at Circe and forcibly remove her from their special spot. I'm sure this is difficult for you too, Circe started in a dark and sarcastic tone, but you two together is never going to happen. You are my mate, Henry. I don't want you hanging around her anymore. Her mate is probably waiting for her, wondering where she ran off to, and what he did wrong. How cruel and unfair that you'd punish two innocent people with such pain simply because you can't let go. Henry's breath became heavy, and it was taking a lot out of him not to attack Circe outright. He knew she was right, and though she was acting very unsympathetic about it, it wasn't her fault. He tried to calm himself down. Henry shot her a daring look before turning back to Mae. I don't know what we can do tonight. Maybe it is best that for now, you go back to Nathan, but I promise you, I won't stop trying to figure out how to fix this. We are meant to be together, Henry whispered as he kissed her forehead again. Mae did her best to control her tears as she nodded. Go now, I'll find you soon. Mae turned quickly and walked off in the direction that she had come from. Henry was left standing alone in the circle with Circe again. He couldn't believe that just a few nights ago, he was laying here peacefully and full of hope with Mae in his arms. Are you ready to accept the truth, lover? Circe cooed. It took all Henry had not to make a snarky expression back at her. No, never. I will never accept that Mae is not my mate, but there is nothing I can do about it right now, and it's not fair to you and Nathan to put you through so much unnecessary pain. I will go with you to finish this ceremony, but I will never stop looking for answers and a way to be with Mae. Henry did his best to use the dark, stern tone his father used when commanding his troops like an alpha. Circe smirked. I am your mate, it's you and me, lover. You might not accept that now, but soon you'll have no choice. Chapter 6, Advice from a Friend. Henry. The sun was shining brightly and pouring in warm light through Henry's windows. He could feel the gentle breeze and hear the soft songs of the birds. It was the perfect morning, but Henry could see nothing wonderful about it. As far as he was concerned, the whole day was gray. He opened his eyes and huffed. He had no reason to move or get out of bed. All he could think about was Circe's crooked smile as she insisted they were mates, and the idea of Mae with Nathan. He could hardly stand it. Henry turned over in his bed and stared at the wall. He could hear his family downstairs starting their day, and he did his best to shut it all out. He grabbed a pillow from the other side of the bed and put it over his head. Henry still couldn't believe that the ritual was over, and he wasn't mated with Mae. The events from that night played over and over again in his mind. He tried to find an error, some logical explanation for it all. But he came up with nothing. The only reasonable answer he could see was for some reason he and Mae were not meant to be. Henry groaned out of despair and frustration. His heart still beat only for Mae. His whole body and soul yearned for her. How could she possibly not be his mate? No, he couldn't see the error, but there still had to be something wrong. He felt certain of it. Henry, dear? My goodness, are you still in bed? It's after 10 a.m., are you not feeling well, darling? Your maid is here. She was hoping to speak to you. Henry's mother called from the door to his room. Henry lifted the pillow off of his face and scowled at her. If it's Circe, tell her I have no desire to talk to her or see her. He grunted out before slamming the pillow back over his face. Please, dear, your father is insisting. Please don't make me go back downstairs without you. Your father won't stand for it. His mother lifted the back of one hand up to her face, trying to stifle the worried tears that were already building behind her eyes. Henry rolled his eyes and threw the pillow aside with another loud grunting objection. Sitting up in bed, he stared ahead at her. She forced a weak smile through her perturbed expression. Oh, Henry, I hate to see you like this. I'm so worried about you. Can't you please try to make things work with Circe? For the sake of the pack? Things are already so on edge now that Well, now that the ritual didn't go according to plan, his mother turned her eyes to the floor and avoided Henry's grimace. He needed no reminder that things did not go according to plan. Just let me get dressed, mother, and I'll be downstairs, okay? Henry grumbled. He waited until she was out of the room and had the door closed behind her before he threw off his covers. Pushing himself out of bed, Henry stood and stretched his arms above his head before shaking off his boxer shorts. He pressed his hands down against the dresser and looked up at his reflection in the mirror. No wonder his mother was so worried. He looked like SHT. Henry grunted again before pulling open the drawers and grabbing fresh clothes. Once he was dressed in semi-reasonable attire, Henry opened his door and begrudgingly made his way downstairs. He knew he couldn't avoid Circe forever. She'd want to move forward soon, as would his family, but he needed more time to figure things out, to figure out how to just be with Mae and get things back to how they belonged. He dragged his feet across the tile floor and into the dining room where everyone was waiting. His mother was standing over his father with a teapot in her hand, while his father and Circe sat drinking their tea with a shared plate of cookies between them. It looked like a picturesque moment from a different time. Henry sighed and took a seat across from Circe. "Good to see you up and about, son," his father stated while slapping Henry on the back. Henry could tell from his father's tone that lingering for days in bed and sulking around the house would no longer be tolerated. Henry grumbled to himself but otherwise kept his feelings about that to himself. No need to cause another scene now in front of Circe. "Well, I'm sure you two lovebirds have a lot to talk about. Your mother and I will be just in the other room if you need us or have anything you want to, announce." Henry rolled his eyes at his father's candidness. Everything in him wanted to get up and march right back up to his room, avoiding both Circe and his parents. Circe waited until his parents left the room and were reasonably out of earshot before letting her mischievous smirk return to her face. "Well, at least I'm getting along well with my in-laws," she giggled, reaching over for a cookie. Henry's face remained blank and unamused. "Why are you here?" he asked flatly. Circe's crystal eyes bore into him, and he felt like she was trying to dig a hole into his soul and nestle in with him. He shuddered at the thought. "It's been 4 days since the mating ritual. Henry, you haven't so much as talked to me, much less kissed me or talked about our future together." "We have no future together," Henry barked. Circe flinched at his words, seeming genuinely hurt. Part of Henry felt a little bad. It was true she wasn't making things easier, but it wasn't her fault they matched, and he wasn't with Mae. "I'm sorry, this is difficult for me," he muttered. "I understand. I realize this isn't what you planned, but I promise I can make you happy, Henry. I will be the best maid and wife, you'll see." Henry's eyes snapped forward at the word wife. He knew the natural order of things. Once two wolves were mated. He had been prepared and planned so much with Mae, but the thought of doing it with someone else made his stomach turn. "What? Well, since we are mated, obviously, we'll get married. That's part of why I'm here. I wanted to talk to your parents and you about starting our wedding plans," Circe admitted. She sounded so meek and innocent, like she hadn't been cruel and snarky to him just days before. "I'm not ready to think about this yet," Henry answered quickly. Henry, every other couple that matched is already planning their weddings and spending happy time together. "Couldn't you at least try to be civil with me?" Henry sighed. He instantly thought of Mae and wondered how she was handling the situation. Was she making plans with Nathan? Had she given up on them so soon? No, of course not. She loved him. He was certain of it. "I'm not ready to talk about this yet, Circe," Henry growled. "I can't think of being with someone else like that." Henry pushed away from the table, and Circe's expression instantly changed to one of anger and malice. "You have no choice, Henry. This is happening, whether you want it to or not." She screamed after him. Henry ignored her and walked straight out his front door. He made a beeline to the last house on the left on their main street. If he couldn't talk to Mae, there was only one other person he could stand to be around right now. Henry balled his hand into a fist and banged it harder than necessary against the front door of the large house. The lawn looked freshly manicured, and the sprinklers were lightly watering the flower beds lining the front of the house. Henry looked forward again when the door swung open to reveal the only person he wanted to see. "Henry, are you okay?" "What's up, man?" Levi asked, stepping aside to let Henry enter the house. Thank goodness for his best friend. Henry didn't know what he would do without him. Levi had always been his support system and listened whenever he needed to vent. And now was one of those times where he needed him the most. Circe came over to the house. She wants to talk about wedding plans, Henry answered in an irritable tone. He stomped over to the dining room and threw himself down on the first open chair. You still haven't talked to her about things? Levi asked after shutting the front door and following Henry into the other room. How can I? What about Mae? Look, man, I don't know how or why this happened, but it did. There's nothing you can do to change that you didn't mate with Mae. But you can't keep avoiding Circe and punishing her for it. Sooner or later, you're going to have to talk to her and make things right, Levi stated in a gentle voice, watching Henry through the strands of dark curly hair falling over his forehead. Levi walked into the kitchen and poured 2 cups of water. He placed one down in front of Henry and took a seat, pulling the other glass toward himself. I know you're right, and I hate that I'm hurting her or making her feel bad. It's just, every time I talk to her, she just makes me so mad. I don't know how to let go of Mae. I still can't believe I'm not with her right now, Henry admitted. I know, man. It's a SHT deal, but you guys knew there were no guarantees. You both have to just move on. Levi took a sip of his water but kept his eyes on Henry like he might act out and do something crazy if he wasn't guarded. I don't know if I can, man. The thought of being with someone else makes me feel dirty and awful, like I'm cheating on her. The thought of her with someone else, it makes me physically sick. I'm sorry, man. I wish I knew how to fix it. Have you talked to Mae at all about this? How is she dealing with it? Levi looked at Henry more seriously and concerned now. Henry shrugged. My father won't let me leave our lands. He's got all our guards watching out for me. No one would betray him to let me see Mae, especially now that she's not even my mate. I have no idea how she's doing. Everyone talks about the couples from that night as a group, saying that everyone is doing well and starting wedding plans. I don't know if that includes Mae or not, Henry answered, his voice barely above a whisper now. He reached out and took a sip of his water. This was supposed to unite our packs. I'm supposed to take after my father, but I don't think I can bring myself to do anything without her. My father seems on edge about Mae and I not mating. I think he's worried it'll lead to war. Part of me thinks he wants that. Well, that's not good. We can't afford a war with Mae's pack. Besides, does your father really think you would fight in such a war? Levi asked in a more demanding tone than Henry felt was necessary. Henry shrugged. It's been a long time since my father really thought about how things affected me or what would be best for me, Henry replied with a scoff. Levi gave him a look of pity, which made Henry that much more irritated. I'm sure your father cares about you and what's best for you, Levi offered. His statement did nothing to change Henry's mind on the matter. I know it might be difficult right now, but I think the best thing to do is to talk to Mae. Find some closure between you two so you guys can start figuring out how to move forward. You mean move on, Henry corrected. Levi sighed. Potentially, I wanted to believe as much as you do that this is a mistake, but I don't see how it could be. You two might not have any other choice besides figuring out how to move on from each other. We could run away together, Henry said lowly. Levi's eyes snapped toward Henry. Please, tell me you aren't seriously considering that? He replied sternly. Why not? I'm sure Nathan and Circe could find other people to be with. You think your father is itching for a war now? Imagine what he'd do if you ran away with Mae. Her father would be just as ready to take up arms. You'd doom both of our packs. We might be doomed anyway, Henry muttered. Levi reached a hand across and gripped Henry's arm tightly. You need to get a grip and talk to Mae. Think everything through. I know this sucks right now, man, but this doesn't have to be the end of the world or the end of our packs, okay? Just think about it. The pleading tone in Levi's voice gave Henry pause. He knew that Levi was right, and he didn't want to cause more destruction and pain than was necessary. He nodded and took another sip of his water. Chapter 7, Negotiations. Frederick. The wind was blowing hard through the common ground, creating a howling sound through the open gazebo as Frederick waited. His guards stood back in the darkness, waiting for direction. He hoped they would not be necessary. He hoped they would be able to find a peaceful conclusion to this difficult situation that they now found themselves in. The rest of the forest was unnaturally quiet. It felt almost eerie, but it allowed Frederick to hear Keith and his entourage coming forward even from a distance. Frederick took a deep breath and tried to prepare himself for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. A light mist gathered around the edges of Keith's jacket as he stepped through the trees into the hollow clearing. His expressionless face didn't shift at all as he made his way up to the gazebo to meet Frederick. Keith's guards mimicked Frederick's in their position just inside the tree lining. It was almost as if they were setting up a perfect game of chess. Frederick swallowed hard and continued to hope that they could find mutual ground and a resolution. Much to Frederick's surprise, Keith reached out a hand. Frederick took it hesitantly. The two alphas stood staring at each other quietly, for much too long. Frederick shifted his weight and started to have an unsettling feeling. Keith had always been a difficult man to read, and Frederick did not relish the idea that he might now be on Keith's bad side for something he had no control over. "I'm sorry we have to be meeting under such disappointing circumstances," Frederick started. His strong voice carried on the back of the wind and echoed through the clearing. Again, Keith remained emotionless. Frederick had a terrible feeling about this situation and did not feel as if Keith would be open to much positive conversation. Disappointing indeed. I was certain, as was my daughter, that this would be a final uniting of our packs. This was supposed to be a healing moment for us. However, it seems the goddess is not pleased with that idea. Clearly, our union is not what the moon goddess wants, Keith stated with a sense of finality to his voice. Frederick felt taken aback. He had expected Keith to be forceful and upset, but not this accusatory. He felt a deeper sense of worry and panic spread through him. Mae still matched with Nathan, a member of my pack. The moon goddess can't be completely against our union of packs, Frederick offered. Keith scoffed. He turned away from Frederick as if just the idea of it offended him. Frederick did his best to stand tall and continue to seek ways toward peace. "You're grasping at straws, Fred, you know as well I do. Her mating with that weakling doesn't call for a union of our packs. No, you had one shot to make things right, and that was this wedding. To be honest, this wedding was a pathetic attempt at peace and union as it was." Keith started pacing around the deck, causing Frederick to feel a bit more uneasy. Frederick instinctively adjusted his position to stand a little farther back. He scrambled his brain trying to find the right words to say. "What do you mean to make things right? I thought we decided that we were working toward the union of our two packs. We are supposed to be finding peace, Keith. Wasn't that the point of supporting our children's love for each other? Wasn't that the point of them mating? How can you flip on me so quickly?" Frederick shot back. Keith's eyes looked a little wild as they locked with Frederick. "Look where that left us. I don't know about your son, but my daughter is heartbroken. She can hardly leave her room, much less look at her mate and start her future. Now, they are both upset by having been torn apart, and there's no wedding to bring anything together. You want to know how I could flip so quickly? What other solution do I have to this complete disaster?" Keith barked. Frederick flinched a little. "Yes, I know. Henry is just as upset as I'm sure Mae is. None of us expected this outcome. It's a tragedy. But I don't see why it has to be the end all. We can still come back from this," Frederick offered. He could feel his panic growing inside and was desperately finding anything he could say to stop Keith's growing hostility. Keith was already shaking his head. He placed his hands on his hips and stomped his feet on the ground. His eyes glared harshly at Frederick, and he swallowed hard, straightening up. He tried to position himself to look equally as strong as Keith. "How do we come back from this? We were already wedged apart, and this is only pushing us further apart. Our packs were not exactly on good terms, and you're expecting me to start in an act of peace as if everything is fine, despite this final travesty? Please, can't we try to find a peaceful middle? Even if we can unite our packs together, can't we at least find another solution?" Frederick pleaded. He held his hands out, hoping that Keith would budge, even a little bit, but Keith narrowed his eyes and crossed his arms over his chest, a clear rejection of Frederick's offer for peace. He seemed determined to create a bigger problem and potentially start a war. "You want a solution? Start with all the money you owe me from the last war. Since you have no grand wedding to pay for now, I'm sure you have some to spare." Keith's words shot out like vinegar. Frederick found himself, once again, surprised at the new lows that Keith was pulling out. "What? You owe me money from the last war we went through. I'm demanding payment now, in full." Keith stood firm in his stance and sounded almost menacing in his tone. "Keith, please, I don't have that kind of money. I thought we were working together," Frederick pleaded again. Keith scoffed and pushed out a harsh laugh. "Please, we had a deal as long as this wedding went through. You're no longer holding up your end of the bargain. I wasn't the one who decided they wouldn't be matched together. I am not the reason this union didn't go through. What do you want me to do, Keith?" Force them into this wedding anyway? Even though they aren't matched? Yes. Follow through on your end for once, Frederick. Force the wedding regardless, Keith barked. How could you possibly ask me to do that? What about Nathan? Or Circe? This would go against the design of the moon goddess. Clearly, there would be worse repercussions if we forced them to marry anyway. Frederick cried out, no longer caring how worried or afraid he sounded. That's not my concern, make this happen, Keith demanded. His voice was as cold as ice and felt like frozen needles stabbing into Frederick. You cannot ask that of me. Frederick felt like his heart was pounding too hard for his chest. How did this impossible situation happen? How is it that he found himself stuck between impending doom from disobeying the moon goddess or a potential war with Keith's pack? Fine, if you will not command the wedding anyway, then I'll give you a week to come up with the money you owe me, Frederick. A week? What do you expect I'll be able to do in a week to make that much money? If it'll help ease your frustration, I'll give you the money that was meant for the wedding, but only if we are aiming toward peace and a more lasting union between our two packs, Frederick offered. Again, Keith scoffed, I don't see there being anything you can do to help lead us down a path of peace. The wedding was our final opportunity to avoid war. Keith's eyes turned dark and narrowed in sharply on Frederick. Frederick felt the weight of the dilemma and almost felt consumed by it. Come now, Keith, please, you can't seriously be thinking of starting a war? Frederick's voice was shakier than he intended. In his own mind, he had wondered if it might come to this. He feared he would have to defend his borders against Keith, but he never guessed that Keith would be so quick to fight, that he wouldn't even entertain the idea of peace. Surely, you don't want to put your people through that. Think of your daughter, she's still in love with my son. I do think of her, every day. Whatever hold your son has on her needs to end if you will not allow this wedding to happen regardless of their designed mates. You'll find a way to pay back the money you owe, or by the goddess herself, you'll have yourself a serious problem. Keith, please don't do this. Please let us find a more peaceful solution, I beseech you, Frederick implored. Keith paused for a moment and looked back and forth between his troops and Frederick. He looked for just a moment like he might change his mind, but his expression quickly hardened again. He held up his fist as a gesture of finality. He would not be moved in his decision. You have till the week is out, Keith demanded again before stomping back off in the direction in which he came. Frederick stood watching him disappear behind the trees, his entourage of wolves alongside him, feeling lost and dumbfounded. Standing silently, he felt crushed and defeated. He was in complete disbelief that Keith wouldn't even consider giving peace a chance. Frederick felt scared and worried for his pack, though part of him felt an angry grudge toward Keith. He didn't want a war. He didn't want to lead his people into a war. He knew Henry wouldn't follow him into a war against Mae's father. For a moment, he considered ordering Henry to marry Mae anyway. He knew that's what his son wanted, but Circe and Nathan would be left alone, hurt, and abandoned. He had no idea what the moon goddess might do if they went against her order of things. Frederick shuddered at the thought. He had heard stories, rumors of wolves and alphas long since past that had turned against her. No, Frederick would not doom his pack to such a terrible fate. He would have to try again to calm Keith and find a way to move on together. Frederick sighed, lost in a mental battle. He hung his head and turned to lead his wolf warriors out of the common space.